Hey guys, so if you're seeing this, you probably know that I've been re-releasing sections of a very long follow-up video I did a few years back so that the sections of that video could be separated and put alongside what they were corresponding to in this channel's playlists. And so this video is actually the last of these re-releases. There are still a couple of sections of that really long video that I have not re-released and do not plan to. And that is because, for example, the comment that's alluded to in that video's thumbnail, that comment didn't really correspond to a specific video. So at least for now, the only place where you can see me address that comment is in that very long follow-up. As with all of my videos, that one has timestamps so that you can skip to whichever section of the video you'd like. Off the top of my head, the other two comments that I haven't recently re-released is the very first one that I address in that video, which was related to the father and son video essay. And then the section where I kind of talk about my thoughts on Cindy and her disappearance. Last year, I actually took that section of video and put it in one of my follow-ups to the Hearing Voices essay. So that in and of itself kind of qualified as me re-releasing that in a more relevant video. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and cut over to the pre-existing footage. After which, I actually am going to come back and add a couple of things to this topic. So moving on to going back number 12, in which I talk about the frozen donkey wheel chamber and the Orchid Station vault that was constructed near it, and how I do not believe that the Dharma Initiative ever accessed the donkey wheel chamber itself. And that the polar bear that ends up in the desert ended up there after one of the experiments in the vault, which was harnessing that same energy that sends people to the exit in the Sahara, went wrong. As we see in the season 5 premiere, when the construction crew is approaching the wheel chamber, Pierre Chang is adamant that they do not drill any further. And then once construction is completed, as we see in the orientation video, I think rabbits were the first animal that they were using as guinea pigs. But I think being exposed to this extremely cold, negatively charged exotic matter, it may have started killing these bunnies. At which point they decided to start bringing in polar bears from the Hydra Station. Now that I've set up all of that context, there was a fantastic exchange between myself and Choekaas, which began with him questioning the plausibility of Dharma being able to transport the bears in the elevator that goes down to the Orchid, as well as whether or not they actually would have been able to fit the bears inside the test vault. In his first comment in this exchange, he says, "I disagree on the polar bears in the test chamber. The skeleton in the desert is a full-grown bear and one that would not fit in the elevator nor the test chamber down in the Orchid." So my response to that was essentially that I'm not certain that I agree with whether or not they would fit. That elevator does appear fairly tight, especially when Ben and Locke are in it and the plants are inside the elevator with them. But in my mind, the way this would work is that a tranquilized, unconscious polar bear will be brought over to the Orchid, loaded into the elevator, which likely would have had the plants removed from it, and then sent down by itself to the Orchid staff that is waiting in the lab below, who would then remove it and prepare it for the test chamber. Now, admittedly, I'm probably not the best judge of what the dimensions of that elevator or that test chamber are. nor am I confident enough to declare with certainty that the polar bear whose skeleton we see in the desert could have fit in both the elevator and the vault. Choekaas, on the other hand, is probably better suited to judge the polar bear size. Polar bears are gigantic. I'm from a country where they reside, and they're massive compared to humans, their paws being twice the size of our heads. Granted, there's differences in sizes and genders. Now, what we did end up agreeing on, though, is that regardless of how realistic or unrealistic it would be for them to get this polar bear down there and into that vault, it is considerably more plausible than the idea that they somehow managed to navigate it through the type of narrow tunnel we see Ben access the wheel chamber through, in which he had to climb down that ladder to get to the wheel itself. For those reasons, I do find it a bit easier to swallow the idea that they were able to get the bear into the Orchid station, and that that's how it ended up in the Sahara Desert. Even if that isn't realistic for that size bear, I think it's a lot easier to suspend disbelief regarding that idea versus the idea that they somehow managed to get that giant bear into the donkey wheel chamber. I just don't see them being built to fit the bears. I am scratching my head on this, since it seems like such a weird thing for the Dharma Initiative to do, making a human-sized elevator and a human-sized time chamber for polar bears. At least the polar bear cages were more roomy. So I did think that this was a fair point. Even if the bears could fit in the elevator and the test chamber, as I believe, I do agree that neither one seems to have been designed with the polar bears in mind. And so this is where I put forth the idea that when they were building and designing the station, they didn't originally have the polar bears in mind. As I said before, I think the rabbits were the ones they were originally using. And it wasn't until later on that they realized the polar bears would be better suited to these experiments due to their tolerance for extremely cold temperatures. Now, that wasn't quite the end of the discussion, and Choekaas actually said something else that ended up leading to what I feel is a pretty interesting discovery. If Pierre Chang mentioned that polar bears were to be transported to the Orchid, then that must mean the Hydra orientation was recorded after the Orchid was built. But he had working arms, and he warned not to divulge his real name. This was a really great point. We see the Hydra orientation film in the epilogue to the series, and in it, it is established that the Hydra station was the first station, or rather, it was station 1 of 6. Pierre does have both working arms, and he uses his real name and hopes that he won't have to resort to an alias in the future.
I'm Dr. Pierre Chang, and this is the orientation video for Station 1 of the Dharma Initiative, the Hydra. For purposes of security, please do not divulge my name to any outside parties. I will not have to resort to using an alias in the future.
Now, in Season 5, we know that in 1977, the Hydra station is already around.
How do you feel about polar bear feces? Because if you breathe one word of this, I'll have you shipped to Hydra Island so you can weigh turds for the ridiculous experiments. Gross.
Pierre is filming the orientation film for Station 2, which is the Arrow, and in that orientation, he is using an alias.
Hello, I'm Dr. Marvin Candle, and this is the orientation film for Station 2, the Arrow.
So this suggests that the Hydra orientation was filmed before 1977. And yet we also know in 1977 that the Orchid is just now being built. So why would the Hydra orientation include a section about transporting the polar bears over to the Orchid? When Choekaas pointed that out, it made me curious to go back and look at the Hydra orientation film. Because as Choekaas also said, granted, the orientation films could have been shot, reshot, and edited over the years. And so I wanted to rewatch the Hydra orientation and see if it was at all possible that the portion referring to the Orchid was edited in later. And what I found was not only was that possible, there's actually evidence that suggests the showrunners and writers meant for us to pick up on that fact. Not once in the entire section where the Orchid is referred to does Pierre move his left arm. In fact, at one point in that section, he holds up a very large polar bear collar, and yet he only uses his right hand to do so.
Affix this tracking device around the subject's neck, at which point it will be transported to the Orchid station for the next phase of research. Remember, be sure to confirm that the female bears have not been impregnated before transport, as the electromagnetic levels at the Orchid have an extremely harmful effect on early-term gestation.
I think Choekaas and I both were pretty delighted to discover that. And this is a great example of how discussions like this still, after all this time, continue to lead to deeper appreciation of the show and the writing and just all these little details. In Choekaas's final comment, he adds, "I've always liked the idea that the orientation films and their timeline is a bit weird because they've likely been shot at different times, re-edited, maybe footage got destroyed, or new information needed to be spliced in or taken out. This is an idea that I too have often liked, but I've honestly never really taken a close enough look at each of the orientation films and tried to puzzle out what had to have been filmed when, based on certain things such as Pierre having both arms. But I will say this Hydra orientation film is a really solid piece of evidence that suggests that is the case." Okay, so in the time since this video came out, Choekaas has actually released a video in his series, the one where he addresses the season 4 finale, in which he expresses that he is still skeptical that polar bears could have realistically been transported down in the elevator and then fit into the testing chamber. He does mention the size that polar bears can grow up to.
Polar bears are gigantic. Just look at these size comparisons, as well as Pierre Chang in the vault, or with Ben in the tunnel. They are the largest bear species. If they are on all four, they are short enough to fit the chamber, but they are too wide for the chamber, since the bears can be around 3 meters from 8 to 10 feet. So they are already too big. Same goes if the bears are upright, standing up.
I did respond to that portion of video by referencing the fact that female polar bears actually don't grow that big. And we know from the Hydra orientation film, in which Pierre Chang says to make sure the female bears aren't pregnant before bringing them to the Orchid, we know from that at least some of these bears were female. But I would argue you could even interpret that to mean that only female bears were brought over to the Orchid station. Obviously, there had to be male bears present in order for it to be possible for the female bears to be pregnant. But I think it's reasonable to imagine that because of the Orchid size and how it was originally designed, that the Hydra staff would be told to only bring female bears over to the Orchid. You could perhaps ask why that wouldn't have been stated in the Hydra orientation film, to which my response would be that none of these orientation films give an explicit step-by-step breakdown of what is supposed to be done. They all tend to be a more broad overview of what the facility is about. So with that in mind, I want to reiterate that I personally am willing to suspend my disbelief and accept that female bears specifically would have been able to be transported down to the Orchid station and put into the testing chamber. And I am certainly far more willing to accept that than the notion that the polar bears could have fit in the underground tunnel leading to the frozen donkey wheel, not to mention the ladder that would have to be traversed to get down there. Now that said, for any of you that, like Choekaas, aren't as willing to accept that that's possible, that that's realistic, that the polar bears could have gotten into the Orchid station, Choekaas did put forth an alternative theory that I actually do find a perfectly reasonable alternative. In his video, he points out that the Orchid construction site that we see in 1977, the structure that they're building at that time seems much larger than just a greenhouse.
We see that there's remnants of stairs, and like we saw in the 70s, this doesn't look like a greenhouse. I mean, look at this, it's an enormous complex.
And so Choekaas theorizes that there may have been a space in that building where they were able to create a larger test chamber that channeled the energy from the Orchid pocket up to the surface, and that's where the polar bears would have been brought prior to that building's destruction, which may have occurred due to one of these experiments going wrong.
Maybe they had the bears here on the upper floor, and then had several of the instruments connected to the vault downstairs in the original Orchid station, and it was all disguised as a greenhouse, with the pipes looking like they're going to the plants around it, but it's all a bunch of instruments to test the bears. However, the experiments failed and the whole thing collapsed, since the state of this station is in much worse condition than the other outdoor stations such as the Hydra, so maybe there was an incident here.
So, to once again clarify, the Dharma Initiative would have had to have built the original station underground next to that pocket of energy. And I do believe that the test chamber was originally only designed for smaller mammals in mind, such as the rabbits and maybe eventually humans. But due to the extremely cold temperatures of the negatively charged exotic matter, which is the reason the wheel is frozen, the bunnies kept dying. And that's when it occurred to them to start using the polar bears, which they already had on Hydra Island. But going along with Choekaas' theory, once it did occur to them to use the polar bears, either because it was always the plan to have a larger chamber up on the surface, or because they needed to build one since they couldn't fit the polar bears down there, that's when they devised a way to channel the island's energy, or that pocket's energy, up from that original test chamber up to the surface level one. And then that's where the polar bears were taken, and then that's how at least one ended up in the Sahara Desert. I do encourage you guys to check out Choekaas' full video on that finale and on that topic, and you can find a link to that in the description. But I think that's everything I have for today. I hope to see you guys next time. Oh, you're still here. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider sticking around and being a constant for this channel by clicking right up here to subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive. In the meantime, feel free to check out previous content from this channel by clicking here or here. Oh no. Please subscribe.